Tonight on Book TV in Prime Time, a discussion and call-in program on the war in Afghanistan. Joining us are two Afghanistan war authors, Mark Moyar and Seth Jones. Mr. Jones' book is In the Graveyard of Empires, America's War in Afghanistan. Mark Moyar's book, A Question of Command, Counterinsurgency from the Civil War to Iraq. Seth Jones, right before we got started, you told me you just returned from Afghanistan. What are your impressions?
Well, my impressions actually have even changed since I got back, because we've obviously had the capture of the Taliban's second-in-command this week. What I'll say, though, is as we move into the late winter and early spring, there will be NATO offensives in Helmand Province, where we're seeing U.S. Marine Corps forces in the central Helmand River Valley, as well as now over the past week, the offensive by Pakistani intelligence agencies and U.S. intelligence agencies against senior Taliban officials in Pakistan. So we're really now seeing an offensive on both sides of the border.
Mark Moyar, has our mission in Afghanistan changed since President Obama came to office, and how would you define our mission?
Well, I think the fundamental mission of trying to provide a stable and secure Afghanistan has largely remained the same. Yet how we do that has changed. We had a large infusion of troops, seen a lot of activity this year already. The Marja campaign, the most prominent example. And I think we're making progress. I think the most important thing, though, is looking at long-term Afghan development. When I was over there last month, that's really what I was looking at, was how do you develop an Afghanistan that it becomes more self-sufficient. And we all know that's important, but the question is how you go about doing that.
And in fact, in a recent Foreign Policy magazine article, this is what you wrote. In developing the Afghan National Security Forces, the U.S. and Afghan governments must combine short-term fixes with long-term development. It is a project that will take longer than American policymakers would like, no matter how many resources they allocate to it.
Yeah, because in a situation like this, you need to develop leaders. I mean, leadership is the key, I argue, and you can't develop a leader in a year or 2 years for the critical middle levels of command. And in the past, we've tried to speed that up to our detriment. I think we've now, just in recent months, finally figured that out, and we are moving towards better long-term development, and at the same time we're doing the short-term fixes in terms of trying to get the Afghans to replace some of the bad commanders who are already there.
Mr. Jones, in the Graveyard of Empires, page 317, this is what you wrote. First step must be to address massive corruption at the national and local levels, which has steadily alienated the local population and fueled support for insurgent groups. Several forms of corruption appear to have specifically contributed to the Afghan insurgency: drug trafficking, bribery among senior officials, and pervasive extortion among Afghan police and judges.
Well, corruption, if you look at World Bank and Transparency International data, they rank Afghanistan at the bottom of countries worldwide. And so one of the things I think we found is when you look back at Afghanistan's previous periods, so for example, the years of Nadir Shah and King Zahir Shah, there were fairly legitimate governments over the course of the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. What we face now is some crisis of legitimacy with the central government. And in order, over the long run, to establish stability and security, there has to be some legitimacy at the central government level. In particular, that means doing something about the large-scale corruption we've seen of government officials involved in the narcotics trade, as well as individuals involved in large-scale extortion and bribery, usually about major contracts, large amounts of cash. This is not just about police checkpoints along the road. This is large amounts of money that are being used. And I think it's actually partly fueling the insurgency, because it's separating the local population from a government they view as illegitimate to some degree.
Are we doing that at all?
Well, I think there have been steps. Most of the key cabinet ministers now, at least in the power positions, Wardak, for example, the Minister of Defense, or Hanif Atmar, the Minister of Interior, actually tend to have pretty clean records. The other interesting thing about corruption that I just note, too, is people often tend to forget that the main insurgent groups, especially the Taliban, are involved in probably more widespread corruption than the Afghan government is. They actually make their money primarily off the drug trade and off of taxing local farmers. So in a sense, the insurgents are doing exactly what the government is, potentially even worse in some of these areas. So we've got multiple organizations involved in corruption.
And good evening to you. Thanks for joining us. If you would like to participate in our conversation this evening, we're going to put the phone numbers up on the screen. 202 is the area code, 737-0001 for those of you in the East and Central time zones, 202-737-0002 if you live in the Mountain or Pacific time zones. You can also send us an email at booktv@cspan.org or a tweet at twitter.com/booktv. Here's a little bit more about our guests. We'll start with Mark Moyar. He's also a professor, along with being an author, he's also a professor at the Marine Corps University, and he's written a couple of books, including his Question of Command book. He's also written Phoenix and the Birds of Prey, Counterinsurgency and Counterterrorism in Vietnam, and Triumph Forsaken, the Vietnam War, 1954 to 1965. Dr. Moyar has served has been several times to Afghanistan. Our other guest is Seth Jones, author of In the Graveyard of Empires. He's also a political scientist at the Rand Corporation and a professor at Georgetown University. Mark Moyar, we've been in Afghanistan now 8.5 years. Is there an end game to this?
I think there is, and it's taken us a long time to get there. I mean, the early years, for one thing, there didn't seem to be much violence or need to focus on it. Then, of course, we had Iraq, and the insurgency really didn't get going till 2005 on a large scale. And then we were slow to react. And as I said, we've tried for several years to sort of ramp up the Afghan forces quickly, but again, it was a quantity push over quality. And that's also, again, gets to the issue we've talked about corruption. The corruption starts with commanders on the Afghan side because at some level they're tolerating this. And, for too long we've sort of let them sort this out. But, just in the past few months we've seen some encouraging examples where we're starting to prosecute people for corruption, governors, police chiefs. And as I mentioned too, we're finally, we've just upgraded the training mission to a 3-star general, General Caldwell. And again too, you're now seeing our best and brightest going over there. For a while, most of them were going to Iraq. General Caldwell, General McChrystal, some of our top officers, a lot of other great folks. So I think we are going to see a turning point in this year.
I think we're actually beginning to see what looks like the U.S. and the Afghans and NATO more broadly potentially moving towards a tipping point. I mean, what's interesting again is we see major efforts in Helmand. There will be very soon an offensive in Kandahar province as well. And what's interesting is over the last really 7 years in particular, the Taliban leadership, the Afghan Taliban leadership, has been able to operate in Pakistan, especially in Baluchistan province and other neighboring provinces, with impunity. The command and control structure has existed across the border. This is the Inner Shura. This week, we've now seen become public information about the Taliban leadership, including shadow governors now being targeted in Pakistan. If this becomes a systematic effort, this begins to, I think, change the game in Pakistan, because this means that nowhere now is safe for the Taliban leadership.
What was the point of pre-announcing our intentions for this week's military actions?
I think they knew the Taliban were going to figure it out. They're very good at surveillance, and they would have seen this massive troop movement far in advance. So I don't think we lost much in terms of the element of surprise. It did enable us to set the groundwork with the local population. Shortly before the offensive, we had a lot of meetings with the local elders, which I think have proved very beneficial, because you're already seeing them now cooperating with us even as the offensive is ongoing. Is also, I think, important to help make sure we had all the Afghan leadership on board.
If I could just add one thing to what Mark said, and he pointed this out, I just want to emphasize it. In my view, the focus in and around this Marja area will probably, over the long run, not be the military operations. They'll be the development side, but they'll also be the political effort. When I've been to Marja, I mean, what you see in Marja is a range of tribal community leaders that have a hold on power. They range from Barakzais and Nurzais to Ashokzai tribe leaders, some Alizais. And part of the negotiations have been to try and co-opt, or coerce if possible, the allegiance and influence of these key power brokers. This will be a major struggle. This is Pashtun area where power is very decentralized. This will be a major struggle over the next couple of months because the Taliban, as they've done historically, will try to co-opt and coerce these same individuals as well.